Good evening. Well, first of all, let me tell you what a pleasure it is to be with you all this evening. And I could not think of a place I would rather be than a group of Christians that are assembled to worship God and for a chance for me to talk about something that I believe is in line with the Scriptures and is something that the Lord would have us to be doing. I'm particularly pleased and humbled to be at a congregation that has reached out and helped to the extent that you all have. And that number was approximately $15,000 that you've given over the years to Churches of Christ disaster relief effort. And I just want to tell you that that number in and of itself is significant. But I also want you to understand there's only two numbers I'm going to give you tonight that I want you to remember. And one of them I'm going to give you now because it underscores what you as a congregation have done. Because of what Churches of Christ Disaster Relief does and how we're organized, and I'll share some of that with you as we go through our comments this evening, every dollar that we receive as a contribution, we're able to turn it into $3 worth of goods. So that $15,000 that you have given over the years really amounts to $45,000 worth of supplies. And on the table in the foyer, I have a box. It's called our family food box. That box cost us about $50, a little bit less, maybe $40, $45. But that box will feed a family of 4 for 5 days. And I want you to think about what that box means to somebody that's lost everything. And I've got it out there so that you can see what all is in that box. It's designed so that you can hand that to somebody who's had a disaster and it's self-sufficient. It's got a manual can opener in there. It's got things that they need so that they can take it and go and eat. And we'll talk about how that has been used over the years. But I want you to also think for a minute from this congregation how many of those boxes you all have paid for with that $15,000. Because the retail value of that box is over $120, and you've given us the equivalent of $45,000. Thank you from the bottom of my heart and from the hearts of those that you've touched. And that's really what I want to spend our time on this evening, is I want you as the body of Christ here to understand what has happened and what happens when you send that dollar to Churches of Christ disaster relief effort. My wife would love to have been with me. She is generally with me when I travel. I'm very blessed to have her accompany me. But we live in North Carolina, and she takes the photographs for the church directory and for the board, and she had already published that she would be there doing pictures today. So she was not able to join me. But she has cautioned me. I'm so excited about this work. Number one, don't talk too long. People don't want to hear everything you've got to say. And number two, make sure you explain what disaster relief is. So as much as I would like to get into and talk about the things that we have done, I want you to, just for a minute, allow me to tell you about the organization itself. We'll get that out of the way. It'll just take a couple of minutes. Churches of Christ Disaster Relief Effort has been in existence for a little over 20 years. It started in Nashville, and it started with good intentions. But as sometimes good intentions don't always work out the way you think they're going to. So if any of you remember a hurricane in 1988 by the name of Hugo, Hurricane Hugo made a direct hit in Charleston. So I don't know if you all remember that when it hit, but it was devastating. What was so devastating and unusual about Hugo was that it came inland. And hurricanes are supposed to dissipate right after they come in. But this one didn't. It stayed intact. It hit Charlotte. It went all the way up through the mountains, all the way up to New York State. It did a tremendous amount of damage everywhere. Congregations in Nashville, and my wife and I have both been blessed to have been born into homes where our fathers were both elders in the Lord's church. I've been going to church since I was 2 weeks old. That's how long my mother stayed in the hospital when I was born, back in the 50s. They did that. And so I've been going to church my entire life. And the one thing I know, no matter where I have lived and wherever I've worshiped, congregation of the Lord's people, the first thing when something happens, they say, how can we help? What can we do? But because my father was an elder, I also know we've got to be good stewards. We've got to watch where we send our money. We've got to make sure that we know where that's going. We've got to know what's going to happen with it. We've got to know who's going to be teaching and what they're going to be teaching as a result of it. And so I respect that. But when Hurricane Hugo hit, members of the church in Nashville wanted to help. They thought their heart was in the right place. They said, we'll rent a truck, a tractor trailer, and let's just have every member of the church that knows about this go to the grocery store and buy a bag of groceries and bring it, and we'll send them down. Now, can you imagine what was on that truck? Everybody had an idea of what they thought people needed. Well, that didn't work out all that well because it wasn't organized. After Hurricane Andrew hit in the early 90s in Miami, our director at the time, Brother Joe Dudney, Brother Dudney was the one that helped found disaster relief, and at age 92, he passed away this past June. He was at work Friday before he died on Tuesday at 92, and he was my boss. He was the one that hired me. He's the one that I worked for. He's the one that every day he was involved with disaster relief. And he saw how much waste there was following Hurricane Andrew, people well-intentioned sending things down there that they didn't really need. We started this box. And I will tell you that the American Red Cross, after they saw our box, have come to us and said, we'd like to partner with you because we've never seen anything as efficient as the box that you all put together, and we can't duplicate that. And Brother Joe thanked them. The head of the Red Cross flew from Washington down to Nashville and met with him. He said, I appreciate that very much. We're very gratified that you like the box and that you'd like to work with us, but we don't need to work with you. We've got the Lord's church. Now, Churches of Christ Disaster Relief, from that humble beginning and from that little bit of a rough start, has distributed over $134 million worth of supplies in almost every state in the country. And so we have an opportunity to talk to you about that from the standpoint of not only what we've done from a benevolent standpoint, but how else that work impacts the lives of people. I'm often asked, is this benevolence or is it evangelism? And my response is, yes, because I don't know how you separate the two. You see, our Lord didn't separate the two. When He went out and He went out to the multitudes, He fed them before He taught them. And what happens when you have a disaster of any magnitude is that you have an opportunity to reach people that may not come to your church building. They may not come and assemble with you. But you have an opportunity to reach out to them and touch their hearts when they may be open. And that indeed is the case. And we'll talk more about that. Churches of Christ disaster relief effort exists only because of volunteers. Volunteers that are members of the Lord's church. And why is it in Nashville? Well, there's a large number of congregations and members of the church in Nashville. And we need volunteers. There are only 15 employees of Churches of Christ disaster relief effort. And I told you what we've done in terms of the amount that we've distributed. You see, when a call goes out, when we have a disaster, and we say we need to pack food boxes, we'll have between 300 and 400 volunteers, most of them seniors, I might add, that come together, and from 10 o'clock until 2 o'clock, they will assemble approximately 1,500 of those food boxes. We'll put a semi-trailer on the road with a volunteer truck driver. They go all over the U.S. That tractor trailer has just under $100,000 worth of goods when it leaves Nashville. It'll have over 300 of those food boxes. It'll have infant care boxes. If you think about trying to take care of yourself in a storm, think about a baby. And this box has everything to take care of a baby: formula, wipes, diapers, everything. We have personal hygiene boxes. We have bottled water. We have cleaning supplies, rakes and shovels and hose, things that people need, bottles of bleach, things to clean out their house. Because let me tell you, regardless of what the disaster may be, the needs are pretty much the same. They're the basic needs. And I'm reminded when we read in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. There are only 2 rules that we have at Churches of Christ Disaster Relief. Number 1, these items have to be distributed by members of the church. Can't be turned over to a government agency, can't give it to the Red Cross, can't give it to FEMA, can't give it to anybody else. Got to be distributed by members of the church, because that's who's given the money and support for that, and that's what they expect. Second rule, has to be given to anybody in need, regardless of whether or not they're a member of the church. And that's going to be really important as we talk in a few minutes and you see how and why that has made such a difference. I told you there were 2 numbers I wanted you to remember. You remember the first one? Every dollar that we get, how many do we buy $3 worth of goods. The other number, and I'm sorry that we have to even talk about this, but in our day and time, you have to be aware of it. 86 cents of every dollar that we receive goes directly on that truck to help people. 86% of what we receive goes directly to help people. And I'm sorry to tell you that there are organizations where less than half of what you give to them actually goes to help anybody. Our number is 86%, and that was just confirmed by an audit last month. And that's a number that I'm proud of, not for pride's sake, but I'm proud because it demonstrates what the volunteers, what members of the church are able to do. And when you see that truck, and maybe some of you have actually seen the truck, some of you have been in places in talking to you where you've experienced that, there is a sense, I get choked up when I see that truck. Not from a pride standpoint, but because my fellow Christians, my fellow members of the Lord's church are reaching out and helping somebody. And you have no idea what that's going to mean. Jennifer and I have been working with disaster relief now for 5 years as of last Monday. My first day was the day of the last Haitian earthquake. And I fielded phone calls because we only work in the U.S. We don't work internationally. And I was forwarding information and calls to Healing Hands, which works internationally, a similar type of organization on the international front. But we only work in the U.S., and I'll tell you quickly why. It was a lesson, a hard-learned lesson. In one of the previous Haitian disasters, I think it was an earthquake, the Lord's Church down in South Florida asked for boxes of food, and we sent them down. They were airlifted over to Haiti, where they were confiscated by the Haitian government. And the Haitian government never allowed any of those goods to go to the people in Haiti. What's more, they fined us $10,000 because they said the food that we had in those boxes was not appropriately labeled as being safe for the Haitian people. And at that point, it became evident that we had a lot of need and a lot of unmet needs here in the U.S., and that's where we focused our efforts. So if you're wondering why we don't do international, that's why. But we have ample opportunity to do good. Well, when I first started, one of the first places we went, and I don't know when you talked about Eastern Kentucky, we did not have this conversation, but that was the first place that Jennifer and I went to. In July of 2010, went to Pikeville. I don't know if it was Pikeville where you're from. Okay, Pikeville, Kentucky. If you have not been to Eastern Kentucky, now I am a Tennessean, and I thought we had hills until I got to Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. They've got hills, brethren, and these flash floods come, and it's just incredible what happens. It was chilling to me because we got there just a couple of days after the flood. We went to Pikeville, and the congregation there in Pikeville was so faithful. I will tell you that it was a great lesson to me. I was trying to meet with the elders to figure out how we could help them, and I couldn't get a meeting time because the elders were out delivering supplies to all the people that needed it. What a wonderful congregation they were, and what a great example they were. There's a little place about 12 miles out of Pikeville called Rabbit Creek. And Rabbit Creek was a little community, had a little stream running through it. When Jennifer and I got there, we're driving along on a one-lane road, hugging the side of this mountain, and Rabbit Creek is way down there at the bottom, just going along, and it looks pretty calm, and at that time, pretty docile. what we noticed were the trees that were along the side of the road, all up in the tops of the trees. Furniture, clothing, debris. That's how high Rabbit Creek had been. And it came during the middle of the night. And my heart broke when I heard the story from someone there at the church about two young men whose grandmother lived in a mobile home along the banks of Rabbit Creek. And about 1 a.m., they went out to make sure that their grandmother was okay and to get her. They got to her home, and they were just going up the steps to that mobile home. She had the front door open, and they could see her inside. And the water ripped that mobile home away. They found her body 3 days later. And I saw something in Rabbit Creek that day that will change your heart forever. Grown men came in to where the church had set up and were distributing these supplies. And grown men came in and they were in tears out of gratitude because we gave them a pair of shoes. Because I guess when you leave during the middle of the night and the floodwaters are rising, they forgot to put on any shoes. They didn't have any. And you think, well, what difference does that make? And as I talked to that congregation, as I talked to those elders, that next Sunday after that happened, they had 3 families worship with them at Pikeville that had never been in the church building before. I don't know if they were ever converted. I don't know whatever became of it. But I know that they planted the seed in Pikeville that God tells us to do. And from then on, everywhere that I have gone, I've seen it repeated time after time after time. I was heard talking to a sister earlier, right at the beginning of service. In 2011, Jennifer and I went to 33 places, from Mississippi to Alabama to Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, that were hit by tornadoes. That is a fateful time period that I will never forget. Because I told her I was coming down Highway 43 out of Russellville, and I topped the hill and saw what used to be the town of Hackleburg, completely destroyed. When we went from place to place, we went to Tuscaloosa. Tuscaloosa got a lot of news, a lot of coverage on the news. There was a congregation of the Lord's Church in Tuscaloosa, the Central Congregation, that lost their building. The preacher there, when we talked to him, he said, we've lost everything here. But the Northport and the West Side congregations in Tuscaloosa said, you know what, we'll help. You can store things at our building. And instead of saying, woe is us, we've lost our building, what can we do? The Central Congregation took those supplies, they loaded them up in pickup trucks, and they went out into the neighborhood. Because let me tell you something interesting about people that have been involved in a disaster. They don't want to leave their pile of rubble because it's still their pile of rubble. They're afraid somebody's going to loot it. They're going to steal what's left out of it. And the Lord's Church in Tuscaloosa took these boxes, loaded them up on pickup trucks, and went out to them. Let me go back. When they pack those boxes in Nashville, the last thing that goes in that box after it's come along a conveyor belt and all the food and items are put in there, the last thing that goes in there is a New Testament. Inside that New Testament is a note, handwritten note by a volunteer, by a member of the church. And it says, this box was filled by volunteers of the Churches of Christ Disaster Relief. Many people all over the United States have given donations in order to make this possible. We're happy to help you in your time of need and hope you find the contents of this box useful. You're in our thoughts and prayers. May God bless and keep you in His loving care in Christian love. And signed by a volunteer. When Brother Lee Jameson, the preacher, said that they went out and took these boxes out, he said they went out and there was a house that most of the house was gone. There was a little piece of the porch left. And said they had gone and taken the first load out and they'd gone back by about 45 minutes later. And sitting on this little piece of a porch, there were 2 children eating out of the food box that's like we have in the foyer. And there was a grandmother sitting on that porch, reading the New Testament that had been left 45 minutes earlier. You see, that congregation in Tuscaloosa did not dwell on what they had lost. They dwelt on the opportunity that they had. And that's what I want us to think about, that when disasters occur, we can help, but it's also an opportunity to reach out. And that has happened so many times. When Hurricane Sandy hit along the East Coast, and you all contributed thousands of dollars to help with that. Churches of Christ Disaster Relief found congregations. By the way, I should have mentioned that. We distribute these supplies at no cost as long as we find a faithful congregation of the Lord's church that's willing to do the work and distribute it. We don't distribute it. We put it in the hands of the elders of the local congregation and let you distribute it as you see fit. But we got to find a faithful congregation. If you've ever traveled up northeast, let me tell you, it's not like Tennessee. It's not like where there's a congregation every few miles. And it was hard to find them, but we did find a few. Many of you have heard of Timothy Hill Boys Ranch. Brother Hill and his wife are from Tennessee. When their son was killed, one of his dreams had been to have a place for troubled young men to be able to go and learn about God. Well, they created the Timothy Hill Boys Ranch out on Long Island. A small congregation associated with them was one of our distribution points. Sandy hit in October. Between October and January, that small group, they set up 104 Bible studies between October and January. And I ask you, how many congregations go a year and don't set up 104 Bible studies? They were able to reach out to people because they demonstrated that they cared about them at a time when they were vulnerable. Last week, Jennifer and I were down in South Mississippi. May not have heard this story because it wasn't a major news event. But on December the 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the little town of Columbia, Mississippi, had a devastating tornado. It was an F3. 3 people were killed. And I heard about it, a place to call. There's a congregation of the Lord's Church in Columbia. Has 7 members. 1 man and 6 ladies. And I left a message. He called me the day after Christmas and he said, I wish we could do something. He said, I don't know what we can do. And I said, is there another congregation around? He said, well, there's one 20 miles away in Hattiesburg. He said, there's a smaller group, down the road about 20 or 30. I said, well, why don't you talk to them and see what we can do? Last Wednesday, a truck went to Columbia, Mississippi. And that brother, who is 68 years old and a retired school teacher, and taught 2 of those girls that were killed in that tornado, took a delivery from disaster relief, and we were with them and saw them as they were working with these other congregations and reaching out. A congregation of 7. Sure, we've had large congregations. They can do it. When the floods hit Nashville and Middle Tennessee back in 2010, I believe, we had lots of opportunities. But my point is, it doesn't have to be high in number. They're reaching out and they're planting the seed in Columbia, Mississippi, and a chance for that congregation to let the people in that town know that they're there and that God loves them and that there are Christians that care about them. In that same string of tornadoes that hit back in 2011, the first place that was hit that day, one of the first places, was a little town of Smithville, Mississippi. Smithville is just located a little south of Tupelo. Every building, every church building in that congregation, or in that town, was destroyed with one exception. The only building that was left standing was where the Church of Christ assembled. And the brethren in Smithville had an opportunity to reach out in a way that they never would have imagined. One of the deacons showed me a cell phone video. That was an F5 tornado. The video showed the water tower with a car hitting the top of that water tower and then dropping straight down. Winds were estimated to be in excess of 200 miles per hour. Everything was devastated. That town of Smithville, Mississippi, those brethren, our brethren at that congregation, reached out to that community. So much so that one of the denominational preachers came into a place where they had distributed, and he said, "What's all this?" They said, "It's from the Church of Christ." He said, "That's not possible. They don't do that." They did do that. The Lord's people did that. One of the most poignant stories that I have, and I'm cognizant of our time, was in upstate New York. There was a devastating ice storm. This story is hard for me to understand, and I believe it will be for many of you. There was a lady that lived out on the edge of town, way out, and this ice storm, I don't mean it was an ice storm that comes and for a few days you're inconvenienced. This was a paralyzing ice storm in Watertown, New York, that devastated the infrastructure. The power system, the power grids were destroyed. There was no power for long periods of time in the dead of winter. She was out of food. This lady was 68 years old. Here's the part I have a hard time understanding. She was 68 years old. Her family had never had any religious affiliation. She had had zero religious training her entire life. She did not know anything about religion. And she told us later that she did not know how to pray. She said she was out of food, and she said, "I wanted to pray, but I didn't know how to pray. I didn't know who to pray to. I didn't know what to pray for. So I just started talking." About 2 hours later, there was a knock on her door. It was our brethren from the Watertown Church of Christ bringing her a food box. 3 days after they left that box, she called the church building. And her quote was, "I've been reading that little book, and I need to talk to somebody." They set up a Bible study with her. She was baptized, and when she died, she was a faithful Christian from reading that little book. And you see, we fail sometimes to recognize what the Scriptures teach us about the power of the gospel. She didn't have to have a study guide. She didn't have to have anything else. She didn't have to have anything except God's Word. And she became a Christian. And when we realize that the opportunity that we have as members of the Lord's church is to reach out to people in ways that you cannot imagine, at times when they're vulnerable, at times when their heart might be open. We had documented several hundred baptisms after Hurricane Katrina. Restorations, congregations working together again that had not worked together for long periods of time. But somebody asked me, said, "Well, how many, what are the numbers?" I said, "We don't keep those numbers. God keeps those numbers. We're seed planters. That's what we need to do." And I want each and every one of you to know this evening that in every one of these locations, the tornadoes in Oklahoma, Hurricane Sandy, the tornadoes across Alabama and the South, the flooding in Tennessee, every single one of those seeds that were planted have your handprints on them because you chose to help. And as the Lord's church, we don't need any organization. We don't need the government. We don't need anybody else to do that. And it has been a real blessing to many, many people. I don't go to any location that I don't have somebody tell me, "I have a family member that was helped by this. You helped my family." When I've been down in South Florida, it's been 11 years since a hurricane has hit there. We go to a lectureship down in South Florida every year. I have people tell me, I'll never forget that food box. It's been 11 years. I have people tell me, my parents lived in Alabama and you were there to help them. A year ago in January, a disaster that we don't think about. Can you imagine what happens when you turn on your water and you don't have any water? You don't have any fresh water. You don't have any water you can use. Do you remember that? It wasn't a big news story. 300,000 people in Charleston, West Virginia couldn't use their water because of a chemical spill. Congregation of the Lord's Church took tens of thousands of bottles of water to take to people. Don't we take it for granted when we turn on that water? That we can wash with it, that we can drink it, we can use it. We can't take anything for granted. Back in Tuscaloosa, that Wednesday, it was a Wednesday when that hit. About 6 young men from the University of Alabama had taken shelter at the central building. They huddled in a little janitor closet. And that's about all that was left of that building. They survived. But when asked, how long was that tornado here? It was somewhere between 25 and 42 seconds. Now, all the things that we put value on from a material standpoint can be gone in less than a minute. The things that we need to put value on are what it means to be a member of the Lord's church. Rarely do we have an opportunity to go back to a place after a disaster and see something positive. But we were able to, in 2013, in July, we went back to the central congregation as they held their first service in their new building that had been rebuilt. They were very quick to tell us, this is not about the building. Because, see what they did, they met at the Alabama Fire College for all that time when they lost. And they had a chance to teach people from all over that didn't know anything about the Lord's church. And when we gathered in that building, in that new building, ironically, it was a very stormy morning. Thunder and lightning, and I thought, are we going to have a repeat? But we didn't. The first hymn that we sang as a congregation in that new building was Jesus, Hold My Hand. Every single one of those members of that congregation, the preacher, the elders, the deacons, the members, all came up to us and said, you're going to find this hard to believe. But that tornado was one of the best things that ever happened to us as a congregation. Because it taught us and brought us back to what the Scriptures teach about what's important and about what the church is, and it's not bricks and mortar. And said we are a more faithful congregation today because of what we went through. And so I often say that while we look at disasters as a negative thing, if that helps us to refocus our faith, if that helps us to be more faithful, if that helps us to rediscover our first love, then there's good that comes from that. If you have an opportunity to evangelize and you have an opportunity to teach people that would never have listened otherwise, that's a good thing. And while disasters are not seen as good things, it's what we do with them that makes a difference. And as members of the Lord's church, if we can use an organization such as Disaster Relief to reach out, then we're grateful and thankful that you help us to do that and that you allow us to do that. You see, as we think about disasters, physical disasters are so devastating. But I ask you as we close this evening, a physical disaster is nothing compared to a spiritual disaster if we have failed to be obedient to God's Word, if we failed to follow what He has commanded us to do, to be baptized, to be faithful Christians working in His vineyard. And so tonight, if you have not yet become a Christian, then we implore that you do that before a spiritual disaster overtakes you. If you are a Christian and your faith has wandered, if it's not where it needs to be, if there's sin in your life, then the brethren here at this congregation would love to wrap their loving arms around you and to pray for you. You see, spiritual disasters last for eternity, and we can't afford to let that happen to anybody. So tonight, if you're not a Christian or if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we invite you to do that now as together we stand and sing.
On behalf of the Lawnville Road Church of Christ, I want to thank you for joining us today for our worship. If you ever have an opportunity, we invite you to join us at our physical location at 1301 Lawnville Road in Kingston, Tennessee. We hope you will come and experience the simplicity of New Testament Christianity, to learn about God, and to become a part of His family. If you have questions, if you would like to know more about the Bible, or if you would like a home Bible study, feel free to contact us by calling 865-717-0444. Or for more information, please visit our website at www.lawnvilleroadcoc.org. Again, we thank you, and we hope you have a blessed day.